Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
He is among the most celebrated and innovative architects working today. Initially earning fame for his acclaimed design of the Jewish Museum in Berlin in 1989, he has since designed concert halls, convention centers, universities, and other major cultural institutions around the world. He is perhaps best known these days as the master planner of the new World Trade Center site. Good evening and welcome to today's Common Ground Lobby Talk, a conversation with Daniel Libeskind, which is sponsored by Penn State's Institute for Arts and Humanities. Mr. Libeskind is on the campus of Penn State to receive the Institute's second ever Medal for Distinguished Contributions to the Public Advancement of Arts and Humanities. In part, the Institute says he is an original mind and creative force, a public intellectual, and he is someone who has not forgotten the ethical dimensions of his work. Congratulations, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
As the World Trade Center towers were attacked by terrorists and reduced to rubble, you were in Berlin, Germany, marking the opening of your first major building to the public. Tell us a little bit, what are your memories of that day?
Well, it's a terrible coincidence because I lived in Germany. I'm an American. In order to build the Jewish Museum, it was a very difficult project, not because the building was difficult, because of its nature, to bring Jewish culture back to Berlin, across the turmoil of unification of Germany, all the things that were happening. And the museum, after 12 years of working on it, opened, believe it or not, exactly on that date, September 11, 2001. And it was the first day that the public was able to come to the building. And I remember I went back to our office that morning, because it was in the afternoon in Berlin when it happened in the morning in New York. And I said, you know, this is the first day I don't have to think about this part of history, the Holocaust. You know, it's now open to the public. It's out of my hands. A new era has opened, you know, of optimism, of something good. And then I saw those devastating images on television, on the screens. And I remarked, not casual, but seriously, that I'm returning to New York, to Lower Manhattan. When I just saw those images, I had no idea why I said it, but I said, I want to be there. I went to school there. My father worked in Lower Manhattan, right around the site. My brother-in-law was an engineer in the Port Authority in those buildings. So I was determined in some way to come back to Lower Manhattan. And how strange that I indeed now live and work right at that site.
In fact, you were born in Poland, lived for a time in Israel, and at the age of 13 went to New York City. How do you suppose that cultural exposure from a very young age helped to inform, or what does it help you to bring to the table as an architect?
Well, first of all, I grew up under communism, under a totalitarian system. As a Jew, and proud of it, in Poland, under communism and anti-Semitism, a deadly combination, it was not easy for us to grow up. But we had values. My parents were Holocaust survivors. They taught us many things, my sister and I. And I think it taught me that you have to understand the world in a deeper way, that the Berlin experience taught me also that you have to be very patient, that architecture is not a sprint, it's a marathon. You have to be committed to something, and it's not just going to be overnight.
Now, in 2002, you were originally recruited to judge the submissions for the memorial at Ground Zero, but because of scheduling conflicts, you were not able to do that. How did you come instead to enter the competition?
That's a very funny story. I was so proud that I would be called by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation to become one of the judges, not just for the memorial, but for the whole Ground Zero design. And I turned to my wife and partner and I said, you know, this is the greatest thing, to be able to be in the distinguished group, to be able to select the design. And then I had a terrible conflict because I was committed to speak in front of a large audience. And I called the LMDC and I said, you know, is there any way for me to come a little bit later, an hour later? You know, they said, absolutely not. If you don't show up at this time, you have to be disqualified. And then I was dejectedly, I was putting down the phone. Somebody said on the other line, well, Mr. Libeskind, then you can participate in the competition. And that's when I decided to participate.
In the end, more than 5,200 people submitted entries from 63 nations. Yours was selected, of course, but of the 7 architects who were shortlisted for the competition, you were the only one to venture down into the foundation of the tower, Twin Towers, before beginning to design. Tell us a little bit about the inspiration that provided.
It was a rainy day in New York, and we were in One Liberty Plaza, where all the architects met with the engineers and all the authorities. And it was a miserable, cold day. And one of the people in charge of the competition said, "Does anybody want to go down to that pit?" And everybody said, "No, we can see it even better from the upper floors of the building." I don't know what moved me to go down, but as I went down there, my view of the world changed. As I descended those deep layers, and as I touched the bedrock where people perished, I suddenly had a completely new idea of what to do on that site. And quite literally, I saw myself coming to America, because I arrived actually just by the Statue of Liberty, almost at that point where the ground zero is. And I thought, that's what it should be about. It should be about the Statue of Liberty. It should be about the light of New York. It should be about people and about connection of the bedrock to the sky of New York. And that's, I actually asked if anyone has a telephone. I called my office, which was at that time in Berlin. I said, "Drop everything you're doing. I have a completely new idea for how to design it."
The Mayor Giuliani, 1 year from the date of the 9/11 attacks, he said that site should, quote, "first and foremost be a memorial. All other decisions should flow from that goal." And of course, it's much more than a memorial today. In fact, the plans fully replace 10 million square feet of office space. Talk a little bit about what your vision was for that space and how you think it ultimately will be materialized.
Well, my vision is what is being materialized. My idea was, yes, I agree. It had to be, the memorial had to be at the center. That was where I started. The memory of that day, the spirituality of that space that could not really be built upon any longer, would have to be the heart and a foundation at the same time for the resurgence of life, for the meaning of New York's identity, for reassertion of liberty, and against the terrorist idea that this devastation would be a permanent mark on New York. And of course, to juggle all these different complexities, which deal, of course, with the memorial, and at the same time, it was not up to me. It was given to us by the government that we had to replace 10 million square feet of office spaces, transportation nexus, and all these things. But I guarded that sacred site so that nothing would be below it, so that we could develop that site with a slurry wall, with the foundations revealed. Of course, PATH trains would have to run there because they're the link to New York. But everything else would be taken out, and there would be a museum, there would be a space around the footprints. And of course, then around that site, I shaped really a living city, a city that's a 21st century city, a city which would rise out of this bedrock and would affirm the beauty of New York, the iconic element which I selected, which is the older buildings would really resemble the torch in Lady Liberty's hand, and of course new streets, lively discourse of the city would be really part of the affirmation of those foundations that are there.
You can actually see the progress being made from your office window, which must be quite a thrill. If all goes as planned, the Freedom Tower, which is the memorial and sort of the centerpiece of this, will be open to the public by 2010, and the entire project by 2015. Tell us a little bit about what you hope this site will communicate to the world about America and about New York City.
Well, I think with the Freedom Tower and with the memorial and with all the other buildings, it's an integrated composition. It's not just some buildings, business as usual, and some site of the memorial. It's an organic assemblage of buildings that, even though they might be done by different hands, because there's so many different people involved, there is a unity of purpose, a unity of meaning. And I think I've always thought that architecture is a storytelling profession, and it has to tell the story of that day, of how our lives changed, of the sacrifice of those who perished there, and at the same time that it has a meaning in New York, in the world, that democracy is affirmed in a way on that site by what is there, and which means affirmation of life. So memory and victory of life in that site, shaped by all the emblematic buildings. The 1776 is the height of the Freedom Tower. It's a meaningful height. It's not just a number. Again, the way the buildings descend around that core, bringing culture to the center of the site, a museum, a performing arts center, a new civic terminal, bringing streets, and of course being very sensitive to the sacred nature of that site and to the fact that New York has always and will always be a city of optimism, as America is.
And as master planner, you made sure that the Statue of Liberty is seen from a very keen and important vantage point.
I made sure that the Statue of Liberty stands in a very significant position to that site, and I incorporated in the Wedge of Light plaza, public space, the light of that day, 8:46 a.m. and 10:28, the times of the first attack and the times of the collapse of the second tower, permanently immortalized really in the light of New York. Now the PATH terminal will stand right on the axis of that. So it will be an experience not just on that day, but particularly on that day, even for commuters who are busily going to work. There will be, in the skies of New York, an inscription of that memory.
My guess is that there are people in the audience here who are questions are starting to percolate. So I'm going to be back to find our first questioner in a moment. But before that, you said that the World Trade Center designs were particularly difficult, not so much architecturally, but socially and politically. And of course, you mentioned just a moment ago that the Jewish Museum was also socially and politically difficult, which my guess that helped you, put you in good stead for this project. Tell us a little bit about the challenges involved.
It's a huge challenge because it must be the most complex project in the world. First of all, you have so many stakeholders. You've got the families of the victims. You've got the governor of New York, governor of New Jersey. You've got the mayor of New York. You've got the Port Authority. You've got investors with their money and their architects. And you've got the subways, MTA, and you've got really the city of New York and the world at the same time in that tight space. And of course, it's not easy. It's highly emotional. It's politically charged. And you have to believe in democracy to do this project. You have to believe that a project needs to garner consensus. That's what is meaningful, to garner consensus in order to be able to be built. And one has to be ready to negotiate through that complex labyrinth of various interests and stay on that path to a project that really means something. And I've had always faith in this project. I believe in it deeply, and I think you will see the results very soon.
You said that a great architect requires a great client, or a great client is important to doing great work. You had multiple clients here.
Well, my clients are the people of New York, are the people of America, are the people of the world who have seen these evil attacks as threats to democracy. And every New Yorker, every person who had passed me by on the street, and because I've appeared in the media, people approach me and they tell me something. And I've had thousands of people not just email me, write me, but stop me on the streets and tell me something. And everyone who has stopped me, in all honesty, has said very moving things to me about what they would like to see on the site, what that site means to them. And of course, that site means something to everyone, and to garner that passion and to be able to inscribe it in concrete and in glass and in the systems of New York is really the huge challenge, and I think we're on track.
You've actually written a book which chronicles some of the politics and some of the disappointments of working on the World Trade Center in your memoir, Breaking Ground, Adventures in Life and Architecture. Can you tell us something about the book and what sparked you to write it, to put this in writing?
Well, what sparked me to write it is people who stop me on the street and say, "Can you tell us more about this? What are you doing there, and why and what's happening here?" So I decided to put it very rapidly on paper. But certainly, it's a challenge, and you have to really put yourself into something of an adventure. It's not, I didn't get all the things I wanted. You have to compromise. You have to understand that architecture is an evolutionary art. It has to evolve on the basis of a powerful idea. But I'm always moved when I look at St. Paul's Church, which is right at the Wedge of Light Plaza. I incorporated actually into the composition. I thought, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president, right around that site, came to St. Paul's Church and prayed after the inauguration. I thought, this is a space that means something. That is a space of America. It's a space that has given to the world the idea of freedom, of liberty, of constitutionality. So I've never had doubt, but of course it's not an easy process, and it's meaningful. And why should it be easy? No one said that such a project should be easy.
Can you tell us what in the negotiations you were most insistent upon and what you are most proud remains, and what was most difficult to give up?
Well, we used to argue about where buildings should stand, or should the memorial be this big or that big. I'm most proud that the composition is as intact as it is, that the memorial and the public spaces are almost half of that 16-acre site I devoted to public spaces. I thought it has to be public, it has to be accessible and open. So I fought for as much public space, and for streets, bringing back the streets, Fulton Street, Granite Street, so that people have access to the site. I fought for the emblematic significance. I fought for the meaningful identity of the memorial, for the slurry wall, for the waterfalls. I fought for the Freedom Tower, that it should ascend towards the Hudson River, towards the Statue of Liberty, with its emblematic height and with its platforms in the old Trade Center heights, so that you could see where they were.
But it's not exactly the Freedom Tower you had envisioned.
Well, I'm the master planner of the site. I'm not the architect of that particular tower, but of course, as a master planner, my responsibility is to shape that tower in a way as an urban element. And of course, to work on a city scale is a big work, because it's not an instant, it's not about this window or that window, it's about the larger complexity of a city shaped. And of course, it's not something done for the next 10 years or 15 years, it's for the future of New York, for the next hundreds of years. So to answer your question, we used to fight and argue over big things, and now we are arguing over inches. Make the street 2 more inches wider. Can you put this building slightly? Can you make the facade of this building less glaring? So again, we are now really in a very different phase of the project, and yet, of course, it's always as compelling as it always was on every level.
You said a moment ago that an architect is a marathon runner, not a sprinter. Using that metaphor, how do you pace yourself in a project that literally can take 10, 15 years?
You have to be a believer. You have to be a believer, and there are forces pulling you to left and right, trying to get you. You have to stay on a certain course and not to be derailed from that course. And what is that course? I think of the Statue of Liberty. I think of what that site means. I think of what it means to every one of those stakeholders, and how to reconcile the often very divisive interests of the different parties and bring them together so that something can be built. And that's the nature of a city: is coming together. It's a community binding together, and of course that involves a tremendous effort. Not all of it is in drawing. Sometimes you have to show up at many meetings, discuss, have very tough conversations, fights, but you have to be prepared to do that. And you're right, it's a marathon. It's not this day and next day. It's staying there for the long run. And that's what my parents taught me, by the way. They said, the good things take a long time, take a huge commitment, and they're difficult, and that's what you should be prepared for.
Speaking about drawings, you are not a big fan of computers. In fact, you say computers plague architecture, and they're way too apparent in too many buildings around the world. Talk a little bit about your style of designing, which is often with models and pen and paper.
Well, that's certainly true. We have many computers in our studio in New York, and many experts, and we use the latest technologies, of course. But I am a believer in the tradition of architecture, which starts, first of all, with a spiritual idea. It has to start with an idea, with a vision. It cannot be just generated by playing games on a computer, as too many buildings are today, by just shapes that emerge accidentally or randomly or chaotically. So I am a believer that architecture is a civic art. It's an art on a civic scale, because it's not only for this person or that person, it's for everyone. It's on the horizon, it has to be sustainable, it has to really work in the long range, and it has to mean something to children which were born way after these attacks, for whom this site will have to tell the story in its urban form, in its architectural form. And that's why I do what I do. I think about it in the way architects thought about it really for hundreds and maybe thousands of years.
You say, too, that almost anything that can be imagined can be built, and that certainly does seem to be true if you look at Dubai, where it seems to be an architect's playpen. Anything you can possibly imagine, even buildings that rotate, are being built in this very oil-rich emirate. Do you really believe that? Almost anything we can imagine can be built?
There is truth to that. We can. We have the capacity. But should we build only what we imagine, or should we build what somehow belongs, what is rooted, often in a less visible realm, not so apparent, And I thought about these things. The traces of the things that are not maybe most obvious have to be also expressed in architecture. And architecture is not an abstract art as far as I can see it. It's not just the inventions of the mind. It's an emotional relationship. It's a public art. And in that sense, it has to be expressive. Just like music. If it doesn't express anything, it's just a bunch of notes randomly put together by an electronic computer. If it's a Beethoven, violin concerto, it's not about the notes themselves. It's about the impact of that idea that is at the core of the human soul and communicates to the human soul. And I think that's no different from architecture.
You mentioned music, and you were an accordion and a piano player, a virtuoso. As a teenager, you played at one time at 11. You shared the stage with Itzhak Perlman in Jerusalem. And then at 17, suddenly you were struck by architecture. What was it that turned your attention from music to architecture?
It's not an easy question to answer because it's nothing really apparent. You drift with your interest, and I was always interested in mathematics and in drawing and in art. And music, and I still think they belong together. I don't think I've given up music, even though I'm no longer performing, in concerts. But architecture is musical on the very simple level that an acoustics of a public space have to be good. So the inner ear is still the instrument of orientation much more than the eye, and certainly the harmonies of architecture do relate in their proportions to the notion of our integration into greater realms than the obvious ones. And certainly music is part of my work.
I just wanted to talk for a moment ago about one of your buildings that does have, you say it's a musical composition. I'm referring to your work in, I believe it's Switzerland. So music is part of the buildings. You can actually see music in some of the buildings you've designed.
You can, and there is an old relationship. The Pythagoreans believed that proportions of strings and vibrations are the same proportions as the geometric proportions of space. And certainly geometry and the precision of music are very similar. Music is almost completely mathematical. The vibrations have to be exact, not approximate, just like in architecture. And there is a tie that through those means, you really reach beyond the techniques that you have available, beyond the glossiness of a building, or the building tells you something. It's a message, so to speak, from beyond to be transmitted to someone else. And without being mystical about it, I think music and architecture certainly share a huge tradition. Great buildings that we all love have musical proportions in them. So, yes.
You work on such a diverse range of projects. I said at the beginning of this program that you've worked on museums, universities, hotels, even homes. Why so many things? Why not specialize in just one kind of thing? Skyscrapers, for example.
It's an interesting question because many architects consider doing, let's say, a museum the most important thing you could do in architecture, or, doing something like that. I thought, cities reflect people's lives. And I would rather blur the lines of the different programs because life doesn't recognize those limitations. And so the way we live, whether we work, where we play, where we go to school, where we go to be educated, where we go to a church or a synagogue or an office building or to a museum, should be integrated in the vision of a city. And I think that's the ultimate work of art, is the city itself, composing the city with beautiful buildings that give the kind of dignity to people's lives that is right for architects to do. So therefore I am involved in building housing and programs that many architects perhaps find too pedestrian, but I don't think there is anything pedestrian about shopping, about living. All of it needs to have a stage that is beautiful, that means something. In
fact, you've said building or designing a home is one of the most challenging things you do.
It's true. Well, designing, we're working on many, let's say, apartment blocks, condominiums, large-scale residential, and it is very difficult. I think this is perhaps why so many architects stay away from it, because you have to think of everyday life. It's not the visitor coming from 9 to 5, whatever. It's how does it feel? What is the atmosphere of dwelling? What does it feel like being there? And maybe that's the most ineffable quality of architecture, that it's not just measured by statistic. It's a feeling that a space communicates, and that's perhaps the art of architecture.
I want to talk a little bit about and show some pictures of the Jewish Museum in Berlin. This is the building that really put you on the map because of its unique design. It attracted public and critical acclaim. In fact, 200,000 people visited this space in the first 2 months. We're talking about an incredible presence. This was a building that you designed at age 54.
Actually, it opened when I was 54. It was my first building. I never designed a building before. Even though I was trained as an architect and I always consider myself an architect, I didn't take the conventional route through architecture. I didn't get a job in an office. I did for 1 or 2 days, and I said, it's not for me. I don't really enjoy this kind of the atmosphere of these offices. So I thought, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll be able maybe to do architecture on another sort of path, oblique as it was. And I was very lucky to win the competition for what was then to become the Jewish Museum. But that was the easiest part. Winning a competition is very, very easy. Getting something built that has that content is the most difficult thing. And perhaps this first building taught me in one compressed lesson many things about what to fight for, never to give up. And by the way, the Jewish Museum at one point across the German unification, the turmoils of what's happening in Berlin, was actually scrapped by a unanimous vote of the Berlin Parliament. They said, we don't need the Jewish Museum. We don't have money. We need to fix roads. We need to build other facilities. We don't need to think about Jewish history right now. But I fought for that building, and it looked hopeless, to go against a unanimous government decision, which says there's a public project. But sometimes you can take on City Hall.
And you've since built a number of Jewish museums. I want to get back to that in a moment, but we have a question on this end of the room. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was recently in Denver and visited the Art Museum, which I loved. But as you probably know, there's some criticism within the artist community that the building is not hospitable to actually hanging the art. A lot of the curves and the slants of the roofs and whatnot. And my question is generally, how do you balance that, the practicality of what you need to do with a building with the artistic vision? And is there a role that you might see for the architect to perhaps push those boundaries some?
First of all, I want to say that most of the artists that I've met and almost unanimous curators of art at the Denver Art Museum love the building. They think it works perfectly with their collections and what they want to do with art. I didn't invent these galleries out of my own whim. I worked very closely with the curators, with the artists, whose installations you see on the walls and inside of spaces. Of course, the museum isn't meant to be a neutral box. That was not the program given to me by the Denver Art Museum. They never wanted a museum like other museums. They wanted a museum that had that pioneering spirit of the West. They wanted a museum that had an identity for 21st century art, for Western art. And they wanted a museum that is dramatic and will reshape the image and the content of how people relate themselves to art. And I think, of course, there are controversies. That's part of doing anything that is even slightly new. Because surely architecture can also lull people to a kind of an aesthetic sleep and just, But anytime one does something new, and I've always been an admirer of anyone who tries to do even something slightly innovative. And I always say, my architecture is 95% traditional, but the 5% other, I want to be new. So, of course, and in all my projects, I've worked very closely with experts and my clients in every building, and their shapes and spaces have followed very much from a discourse with those who commissioned the buildings. So I stand by it, as does the museum, and as the artists, by the way, and kids and others. Sure, some people think it's way out, whatever, but in a short time it won't be.
You said earlier that architecture is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's also a collaborative enterprise. Tell us a bit about Studio Daniel Libeskind. What is a Libeskind? If there's a signature that says this is your building, what is it?
Perhaps I can tell you the way I work. I don't have an office. We have a large studio in New York. I don't have an office with a chair and with a door. I'm part of. I don't retreat and do something. It's a collaborative effort. There are many young architects, many people who have to be involved in constructing large-scale projects. But what I love about architecture is that it's a hands-on What that signature means, it means that you're involved in every aspect, from the big idea to the tiles you select for the bathrooms and the door handles that you want to design. I always consider architecture something to do with craft. It's not an abstract, washing machine or at a large scale or some sort of dishwasher standing on the horizon, but it's a crafted work. It's a handmade object. It's a thing that has been made, and in that sense, perhaps that's the signature. That it's not reliant on abstraction. It's not reliant on detachment, but it's actually very much involved in the thing itself, whatever that thing is.
Bad architects, you say, build exactly what they proposed. Architects need plans, but the plan is merely a two-dimensional thing. Tell us how you deal with that, this evolution of a building.
Well, I was criticized in New York for transforming, for evolving my plan. People thought, I should build exactly what I drew. And I said, well, of course you have to build exactly what you drew, but it also has to evolve. I did this in a competition, across 4 months. We're going to be building a project for the next 150 years. We have to analyze every single aspect. We have to develop it. So I'm not one of these architects who does a sketch and says, okay, now build it. Because I think that's the interesting part of architecture. Architecture is interactive, that it brings into discourse many other fields. And the more you are open to it, the more you can learn from it, the more you can integrate it into a project. So yes, the drawings have to be open-minded, just like a mind has to be open-minded. Otherwise, it would be a closed mind. Nothing would ever enter it. So yes, the drawing is a tool, but it has to evolve. And of course, at the end, drawings have to be very precise because you have to build right down to the millimeter, when you're building a wall or a window.
Penn State's Institute for Arts and Humanities, in its award that it was given to you, it said that you are someone who has not forgotten the ethical dimensions of his work. Talk a little bit about the social and moral responsibilities of an architect.
Well, an architect, I think that's the essence of architecture, is the door for someone who will enter, who you don't know. And it has to be a beautiful door for an unexpected stranger who will enter the space. So it's a deeply ethical profession, I think. Of course, you can say that architects don't practice it that way. They think about money, they think about this, they think about that. But it is an ethical profession because it affects a large public. Even if you build a building somewhere for somebody, it's still on the street. It still forms a part of your world. And it has to take that as a very serious aspect of its responsibility. So yes, I think buildings from the beginning of time, in a way, have an aura of the sacred because they belong to the world. They show you something that perhaps you haven't seen, like the sky and the earth, in a totally new relationship, and give you orientation to a future that has to be, I think, a good one. And in that sense, it is.
You said the word aura, and I think of aura as something that a person might possess, but you say buildings actually possess them. Is there a building in the world that is among your most favorite, that is the most inspirational to you?
There are many such buildings. The history of architecture is a kind of cross-section through time that is always kind of eternally in the now. Even buildings in the ruined states. You go to the Parthenon, or I look out of my window and see the spire of the Chrysler Building, which is so beautiful. These buildings inspire you. They're forever new whenever they were built, and they give you a new image of the world, something positive, something that makes blood flow quicker through your veins. And I think that's the contribution that architecture can make. It's just like all the other arts, except it's an art that brings them together, and not by coincidence that the Greeks and others, ancient civilizations, China, India, everywhere, thought that architecture is divine. It is dependent on the divine because it's in the space of the world, and it's also in the space which you don't see, which are the foundations, deep below. And it's about stability. In a world which is always accelerating, changing, dynamic, it gives us stability to the world. We often don't appreciate it. The architecture is static, and it has to be at the same time something that inspires us, that moves us, that is dynamic, and yet it's our home.
All right, I think we have another question over here.
Actually, you've hit on the question just as I was about to ask it. I was going to ask you about the spirituality of some of these projects that you've been involved in. Is it difficult to work on a project like the new tower with so many people who have so many different faiths involved? And how best can you bring out the spirituality that will inspire us all?
The spirit of democracy. is what inspires me to be able to go to these meetings, which sometimes look very hopeless, with architects and investors who have not a care for what I'm thinking or doing. They only care about some abstract monetary transaction. And yet, I think being inspired by democracy, being inspired by the fact that this site at Ground Zero, for example, is not a tabula rasa. It's not some abstract site where a king or a governor or somebody says, go ahead, build X or Y. It's right in the midst of that marketplace, and yet it is a sacred ground at the same time. And I think that's democracy. Democracy is not just voting yes or no in an election. It's fighting for the values and things that we truly believe in. And I think that's what makes America such a great country and what makes New York such an exciting city.
I'm wondering what's missing in the American city now, and if you think that the basic relationship between the citizen and the city needs to be reconsidered.
Well, I think it's true. I think people are becoming aware how important cities are for our future. That driving to the suburbs, that spreading out is not the most efficient or best thing that we can do with our resources, which are shrinking and so on. But it's an ancient thought. It's a thought about how to live together in a space that gives us opportunities, develops us, gives us... think about it on the simplest level, about a spirituality or architecture. If you have a window, you will see the world through that window, and you see whatever is standing on that horizon, and that's your world. If it's a beautiful window, sometimes I just alter the angle of that window, just slightly, ever so slightly, and suddenly the horizon is different, and you look at it. So again, with very simple means, one can effectively transform the way people relate to other people who live in their neighborhood. And I think we know from history that beautiful cities are precious, that they mean a lot, because people can develop themselves, they can find themselves, they can find the world in a way that is positive, and not simply take it for granted as just built material world.
You have a number of projects in various stages of development around the world, in Milan, Italy, in Hong Kong, in Switzerland, for example. Did your involvement in the World Trade Center as its master planner, did it change your career opportunities in any way, or were these buildings all things that you were working on prior to?
No, you have to remember, for the first 13 years of my life, I did only one project, the Jewish Museum, which opened and closed, by the way, on September 11, 2001. Because it opened to the public, and I didn't mention it, that because of the uncertainty globally, what those attacks meant, the museum closed its doors. And I thought, what does that mean for the world? Our world has changed. But of course, I'm a lucky architect. I was working on a number of projects, of course, during that time too. But I'm lucky that now, of course, I'm able to do many projects around the world, and certainly many towers around the world. And you follow a path. You don't know where you're going. At least I don't. I didn't, like the business gurus, have the idea that you have to have a goal in life and get your goal and go after your goal. I never had that idea. My idea was to stick to a certain path. Sometimes it was very obscure, and I didn't really know exactly where it would lead me. And it's still like that. You still have to follow a path and accept and do things that you believe in, and who knows where it leads. All I know is that it's given me tremendous satisfaction, and I'm a very lucky architect.
Your wife says you're a late bloomer.
Well, surely I am a late bloomer. I think of myself as having lived my life in reverse, because according to the Greeks, you should live the first part of your life as an active life, and then you should have the meditative life to reflect back on what you've lived through. I reversed it. I had the meditative life before. I was an academic, I drew, I thought, and now I have to compensate for it by leading the most active life.
We have another question over here.
How do you see the world and maybe the future and the challenges that we face, and how building can perhaps respond to this? You mentioned things like ecology and resources. And how would you see building in some ways, or architecture, responding to these things, especially when you bring up also living together? I
certainly think we have incredible opportunities today. In a way, I think we're living through a renaissance of architecture. For many years, the ideologies of architecture made it seem that it was just a mechanical profession, that it was just some technical know-how that was needed, like building cars or something. But now I think people have rediscovered that it's a cultural field, that architecture belongs to everyone, that we care about it. There is a global kind of resurgence of rediscoveries of what architecture can do, materials from which it can be built, how it can be sustained, how it can positively contribute to the environment. And I certainly think this is a great time to be an architect. When if you think just some years back, it was the era of the isms. It was just an ism, functionalism or something. You used, there was a formula, there was, you followed a certain route. I think now when you look around what's being built around the world, there's a kind of explosion of new ideas. There's an explosion of awareness, and I think it's going to lead to completely unpredictable realms that are very interesting.
Your West Side project is interesting for a number of reasons. This is in Switzerland. You say it reinvents the concept of environment and shopping in 21st century. One of the things that's most interesting is that there are homes for the elderly within that complex. Tell us a little bit about how that project came to be what it is.
Well, it's, first of all, the largest sort of mixed-use project in Europe. It has vast shopping facilities. It has wellness facilities. It has convention centers and hotels. It's on a highway. It's a whole city. Just to give you an example, there are 17 cranes right now on that site, 17 large-scale cranes, to give you just the scale of the project. Kind of like Potsdamer Platz in Berlin of that scale. But I also thought to bring other activities. And I thought this would be a great place for people to live, particularly the elderly, because there are a lot of young people hanging around. And again, my idea was not to create just, of course, mechanism of shopping is a formulaic one. People, shops have to make money. There are big boxes. Which merchandise is processed. But I thought, what about the public spaces? How can you take the public spaces where people meet, where they can eat, where they can have fun? How can you innovate in those spaces? So I didn't change the formulas of what is required, but I created public spaces that are really unprecedented in that environment and brought other programs, living, recreation, children, families, and I certainly think this will be something very different than the road, shopping centers or mixed-use developments on highways, across the world.
The Jewish Museum in Berlin led to your design of the Jewish Museum in Denmark, in California, and Canada. They're all very, very different, and hopefully we'll get to see some of them in just a second here. What did you have in mind? How did you want people to feel and engage in these spaces? Because they're very different, especially in Berlin. There are some spaces that are, in some ways, very oppressive and almost cave-like.
Well, as I mentioned, I believe that architecture has to tell a story in synergy with exhibits, always, whatever that story is. And of course, in Berlin, it was how to bring that story, not only of the tragic and irreversible past, the Holocaust, the extermination of a people, but it has to tell something hopeful. If architecture didn't have any hope, you would not practice it. There would be no world possible. So how to introduce difficult histories, but also introduce hope, something that has a new possibility in it. And of course, that's very different than when I'm designing the museum in San Francisco, which happens to be the contemporary Jewish Museum of San Francisco, which is inside of an old power station. It celebrates the life of San Francisco. It's an ecumenical building that tells the story of life and liberty and fantastic things in the west of America. Very different, completely different, nothing to do with each other in a way. One is in the European context that has the dark eras of history, and at the same time a new city developing, New Berlin, New Germany, a democracy. Of course, in San Francisco, it's about celebration of that community and of that city and of that tight context, where there are hotels, the St. Patrick's Church, the Mexican Museum, the Jesse Plaza, very different. So each building has to have a unique content, and it has to respond uniquely to its program and to the fact that you can't interchange buildings. There are many buildings in the world that you could say the same building could have been built or there, but I believe that each place is unique. It's irreversible.
They work where they are.
Wherever they are, they have to be unique because there is no such ground anywhere else on which they stand, and there's no such history as that particular land and sky in that place.
I think a lot of people will be surprised to learn that you actually live in a very modest loft in Tribeca. Tell us a little bit about your own home.
Well, it's a very small, New York is an expensive city, and we live very close to where we work. We're very fortunate. We can walk to work. But But I've always, throughout my life, I lived in rented apartments. Actually, my parents were working people. They worked in sweatshops of New York. They were the quintessential Americans. But they lived well because they lived in social housing, for example, in the Bronx, where I grew up when I was an immigrant to America. So now we have a small space. It's not large, but I'm very lucky because you don't need a lot of space when you have the skyline of New York and you can look at it.
You were appointed by the State Department as the first ambassador of culture for architecture. I'm wondering what that job entails.
Oh, it's really a privilege more than a job. It's to be a because the State Department has a program where artists, musicians, people in sports promote a conversation with people across the world. And they introduced this new field, architecture, which was never part of the State Department's idea of. But as a result, I had a chance to speak to audiences in distant countries, many Muslim countries, about America, about architecture, about what connects us across the divides of religion and society, what unites us as human beings. And architecture is one of those uniters because we live on this earth all together.
We talked earlier about a great architect, a great client is essential to architecture. Do you have a favorite client? Was there a favorite project to date?
No, I think I've been fortunate that the buildings I worked with, I had great clients. In Denver, I had inspiring clients, the Denver Art Museum. I mean, they were fantastic. The people always encouraged me to go further. Instead of saying, no, please, don't give up. Go further, Mr. Libeskind. Don't be shy. We're in Denver. We can do anything. The New York clients, as difficult as they were, every person, telling me, don't do this, do that, don't do this, do that. Remember this. It's very difficult, but great client because it's the grand public of New York, and you have to somehow balance all the different interests in a project. But I've been fortunate that, look, even the Jewish Museum in Berlin, that was, I would say, a very difficult client, even though it was a great client, the city of Berlin, the state of Berlin. But because the museum changed its names 6 times. It didn't start out as a Jewish museum. It started a small department of a big museum of the city. It went through name changes. It went through changes of concept, what it was going to be. It went through changes as to what is going to be shown in it. What a process to be starting your life as an architect with. But it all adds up to something more interesting, that architecture is not just a ready-made that we already have. It's also a dynamic art form that is part of whatever else is going on in the world, and it has to be affected by it and also express it.
Now, you no longer play piano. You say, quote, it's hard to be a hobby player when you were once a virtuoso. But you're currently, and I think this is remarkable, and I think people will be interested to hear this, you're redesigning the architecture of the grand piano. How might you change the piano?
Well, as a matter of fact, I was commissioned by one of the oldest companies in Germany, Schimmel, who produced one of the earliest pianos. They said, Mr. Libeskind, why don't you design a piano? And that was a tremendous commission. It's actually in production right now. And I thought, why not change the form of the piano? Why not liberate the piano from that, that shape? There's no acoustical reason for that shape anyway. It was just how piano originated. And so I'm lucky enough to be designing, really, I think, a piano that is more like a wing that takes...
I was thinking there would be angles in this.
Actually, it's a curve.
Okay.
But it's also angular. There are angles in it as well, of course. But I thought, a piano should be beautiful to be played, and I appreciate great pianists. They have to feel comfortable at a piano. You can't really redesign the attitude towards the piano, but also it should be beautiful for audiences to look at, because very often we look at at a great pianist, and we look at that object and we wonder, what does it have to do with the notes Horowitz is playing on the Scarlatti sonata. So I tried to do a piano that would be as good for a Horowitz as it would be for Elton John or for Prince, who, by the way, are ordering their pianos.
I was wondering just how difficult it will be to sell. We're such traditionalists about a lot of things, and the piano is probably one of those things.
Well, I try to create a balance, not immediate. Again, when we often talk about sort of bringing something together, we often think that is mediocrity. And people think often that if there are many hands in something, it's going to be mediocre, but that's not necessarily true. If there's an idea to it. So I try to sort of balance out the classical piano, the attitude of a great piano, also with an object that would be inspiring for us into the future. And I think it will sell.
We're anxious to see it. When do you think they might be someplace where the average person can see it?
I think we are because part of the piano was also, and that was part of the design, to redesign even a better acoustical keyboard, better piano. And by the way, the heavier the piano is, the better the sound. So we designed a very heavy keyboard that can really produce that sound. And also I think a piano that comes in two versions. There's a smaller version, and a version where you can also transport it in two pieces. If you have a small house, you can get it in two pieces through a window or through a door.
Did you have to bid for this particular commission?
No, okay. I did not bid for it. It was very nice. Mr. Schimmel, who is an expert in pianos, came with his son. It's a family-owned company in Braunschweig in Germany, and he said, we would like you to do it. We know your work. We'd like to, and they were fantastic. They didn't say change this, change. They said just how can we make a piano work better? How can we make it beautiful? And I think we will have something interesting.
You said earlier that winning the competitions is not the hard part. Seeing them through, seeing the project through is, but you've won a lot of highly competitive bids in your career. Tell us a bit about the bid process. Sounds like it can be a nightmare. Architecture is a very competitive, there's something very competitive about it. I guess art in itself is a competitive, when you think of the Renaissance, you think of the competition between the various architects and artists for a building, for a design of a sculpture. It's always been a competitive field, and it's not an ugly competition, although sometimes it can get ugly, but it's a competition for an idea sometimes. And if you're fortunate to win, you are on a long road to convince others to build what initially seems to be an inspired idea and how to negotiate and evolve it. But it's a thrill. It's kind of it's not so different from marathon. I watch marathon runners. I'm not myself one of them, but I watch how they time themselves, how much stamina you have to have, what an incredible plan you have to have. How to pace yourself, how to look at the others around you, and at the same time be completely fixated on the fact that you have to win, that you can't come in second. At least you don't want to. Studio Daniel Libeskind, you have offices in New York and in cities throughout Europe. Tell us something about the team that you surround yourself with.
First of all, I have to say, otherwise it would be fraudulent, that I wouldn't be able to do what I do without my wife, Nina. She's my partner. She's not an architect, but she's my full partner, and she doesn't just do finances. Most people think, Frank Gehry's wife works with him. There are many couples that do architecture, but most of the wives maybe do something. But she's fully involved in architecture, not as an architect, but as just a person. And I thought, that's an incredible thing. And I actually, when I moved to Berlin and I won the competition for the Jewish Museum, we were walking across the street, and Nina turned to me and she said, "What are you going to do now?" Because I had this incredible fellowship to the Getty in California. And I said, "No, we're going to stay in Berlin." And I said, "Under one condition." And she said, "What? What is that condition?" I said, "If you become my partner in architecture." And she said those fateful words. She said, "But I have no idea what an architect does." And I said, "That's the same thing is true for me." So we're both exactly in the same. We're starting at the same, and it's been a wonder. So, and of course, the team that we have is an amazing team. It's a team of architects from all over the world, from all cultures. Really, we are very fortunate. Many young people with very creative ideas, and it's a collaborative. It's not like an office, which I always hated, where people just sit around desks or computers and sort of do their job. It's more an adventure to do things that kind of are spirited and often are not easy to accomplish, but it's a great team. I'm very lucky.
I think it's obvious to see just by watching you right here that you're a very optimistic person. In fact, in the difficult, you said even sometimes ugly days of the early days of planning for the World Trade Center, you said if you ever become a cynic, you're going to get out.
It's certainly true. I would say that, and I've thought about it a lot, that you can be a pessimist almost in everything else in life. You can be a pessimistic politician. You can be a pessimistic writer. a composer who prefers the minor key. You can be pessimist as a poet, as a filmmaker, as an economist. But you have to be an optimist when you're building something, because the act of building itself is something that is to bring a better future. That's the faith you have in what you're doing. It's to promote a future. And so in that sense, I don't believe that architecture can ever attract a cynic, because it just wouldn't work. The buildings would fall apart very rapidly.
You mentioned poetry, and in fact, you have written poetry. Fishing from the Pavement is a book of your poems. Can you tell us something about it?
It's strange that I saw it really first published in the editorial pages of the Post that quoted it. It's a very obscure small book that I wrote on a moment of sort of madness or inspiration, and it was many years ago. But sure, writing, drawing, all those things are part of tradition of making a building as well.
You also create set designs for opera, so I'm just amazed at the number of different things that you do or have done or been part of your life.
The most interesting set I think I was involved in when the Deutsche Oper in Berlin asked me to design first a set for Messiaen's St. Francis of Assisi. And then they said, well, but we don't really want you to just design it. We'd like you to direct the opera, which I agreed to do, which I did. And then they said, but we'd like you to conduct it. And that was a trick question, because when I looked at Messiaen's score, it would take me 6 years to just absorb that amazing piece of music. But I am fortunate to be involved in other things, because it's a lot of fun. And sometimes amidst the long range of architecture projects and the short range of designing a stage set for Wagner or whatever, you have so much fun and you see kind of immediate results, although of course they are very, very ephemeral.
How do you reconcile the idea? In many ways, the Jewish Museum in Berlin may be your crowning jewel, but your legacy will probably be the World Trade Center.
Well, I hope that both those projects, but also other projects, because those two projects touch on very tragic events in totally different ways. They have nothing really in common with each other, except that at the center of those projects is thematized my greatest interest, which is memory. Because architecture is about memory. If we didn't have this importance of architecture as memory, we would lose our orientation. We would not know where to go to, what to do. We would become amnesiacs without any orientation. So to me, memory is the key to architecture. And of course, even buildings that seem on the surface to just celebrate art need to be memorable, need to inspire with the same notion. But certainly those two projects that you mentioned and some others do touch on events that are so deeply embedded in our collective communal psyches that they have their own importance and kind of destination.
You are good friends with the famed architect Peter Pran at the University of Kentucky. He says of you, he comes up with new ideas no one's ever designed before. Very few architects are so creative. Just wondering how you respond to that.
Well, you try to do your best. And design, as I said, it has to be 95% known. You can't experiment in architecture. You can experiment maybe in other fields because it doesn't really matter. But in architecture, you cannot really experiment because it's also a place to live. But you have to innovate in some way through awareness of what you're doing, and you have to somehow look. There is in the old Hasidic literature, which I love, and my mother came from a very Hasidic family. One of the rabbis says, at the end of every day, you should ask yourself a question: did you reach a slightly better level of understanding of what you're doing, a slightly higher level of the spirit today? And if you answer no, then you haven't done the right thing that day. So I try to ask myself that question. After a laborious day of very prosaic things, I ask myself a question: did I do all I could today to make this the best possible day? And
what advice would you leave for up-and-coming architects, students studying architecture right now?
First of all, I'm not wise enough to give advice to anyone. But if I would give advice, I would say, you have to take risks. Everything is at stake. And the risk is a huge element here, because if you just follow the well-trodden highway, you might not really fulfill what you want to do. So you have to sometimes take a risk to go on a path that seems to be very vulnerable. And yet I think that vulnerability is actually what makes that path important.
All right, well, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank
and
you so
thank you
much.
all for coming.
Thank you.
For all of us here at Penn State Public Broadcasting, thanks for joining us. Our special thanks to our guest, Daniel Libeskind. For Penn State Public Broadcasting, I'm Patty Satalia.
This has been a production of WPSU.